Hi, everybody. In this lecture, I want to talk about playing around, reading drama. And let's start with this simple question. What is a play? Just pause and think about that. When we say a play, what is a play? Well, most of us probably think, if this term is familiar to us at all, that a play is something you go see performed somewhere on a stage, right? Probably our first thought isn't it's something that we cuddle up and read, although we might be aware that, we can read plays. But generally, it's something that we think of as if it's a play, if it's a noun, that it's something we're going to see. Nonetheless, we know that plays are printed, and this is a literature class, and that means we're going to be reading this thing called called plays, um, that are also literature. So when they're printed on a page, a play is essentially a set of directions for how to perform it. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in this lecture and why that's important. But we just want to note off the bat that when we talk about a play, our instinct is usually to think that this is something we go to see. Um, so when we're reading a play on a page, we want to keep in mind that what we're reading is something that ultimately is supposed to be performed. And this means that plays are an odd literary genre because they straddle two worlds. They're deeply related, but they are two worlds, the page and the stage. And what I'd like to do is talk about how to use this knowledge and awareness to understand plays and deepen our experience of plays or of drama, which is kind of the genre that we're talking about here. When we're talking about plays, we're now talking about drama, and we can think about drama as a form of literature. But again, it's a form of literature that straddles both the page and the stage, unlike something like novels, which are generally literature intended to be read uh, silently to oneself, in the case of the novel in particular. But let's talk about, on the one hand, how plays are like other literature. So how are they like other literature that we have read? So again, let's just to note, as written works of art, because they are written in the modern world, plays are clearly a written thing, um, but uh, they're also a performed thing, right? But as a written work of art, plays are literature, which is why we can read them and talk about them in a literature class. And they share many elements of with fiction, especially, but also poetry. Okay, so when we're talking about and digging into plays and analyzing them, writing about them, we can talk about many of the same things we've talked about with fiction, like plot, right? Plays have a plot structure, and a lot of that vocabulary will still be a lot of the vocabulary you used and we developed back when we were talking about fiction can be applied to plays, right? So you can have things like protagonists and antagonists and rising action and crises and climaxes and falling action and denouement and all that stuff. Obviously, you have characters. And we can talk about characters and things like character development and epiphanies and the like. There's a setting. Quite often in plays, there's some sort of setting. In fact, in plays, we have something called the set, which refers specifically to the actual stuff on the stage that sets the scene. We can talk about symbolism. We can talk about themes and how a play explores certain themes and sort of creates certain perspectives on its subjects in the form of a thematic kind of exploration. And with poetry, drama, plays can also be language playing at play. Just like poetry at some level is a language at play. It's a language that is drawing attention to itself as language, as something to listen to, as an aesthetic object. And just as a word, I'll talk about this a bit more in just a second. For a lot of Western history, plays were often written in poetry. That was actually the norm. It wasn't until much more modern times that plays were written in prose and everyday speech. Historically, since we've had printing anyway, since we've had printing since, say, the last 500, 600 years, plays have often been printed and read, just like other literary works. So for the past several centuries, even though plays are a performance art, plays have been printed and read like other literary forms. And just like other forms of literature, there are a number of genres and subgenres when we talk about drama. And when we talk about drama, tragedy and comedy are the oldest two forms, going back thousands of years, right? And there are lots of other genres in drama and in plays as we move closer to the modern world. But tragedy and comedy are two sort of big examples that we'll often learn about when we're studying drama. Okay, so much for similarities. How about the differences, right? How are plays different from other literature? The obvious one is that plays are meant to be performed on a stage. They're generally not meant to be merely read silently. Sure, we can buy a copy of a play. Plays can be published in a book like the one we're reading, but right, they're ultimately performance art. They're meant to be performed on a stage. Because drama is a performance art, and because it's a performance art, it's also a communal art form, meaning ultimately the play is performed for an audience. So that puts it in a different kind of category from, say, the novel or from, say, lyric poetry, which are generally meant to be read alone. So because of this, we should think when we're reading a printed play, we should think of that printed play, as essentially a script, or another term I will use that is often used in the field, a play text. We can think of that as a kind of blueprint for performance. So the object that we're reading on the page, let's think of it as a blueprint for performance, because performance is ultimately what will bring a play to life. So this means when we read a play, as you're going to be in this class, by and large, reading the plays, um, we should read with a theatrical imagination. A term I'm going to explain in more detail in a second, but essentially it means that as we read, we try to imagine as best as possible how the play, the thing that we're reading in front of us, how that text might be performed by real actors on a real stage. And I will talk again in more detail about that in a second, but I want that to be foremost for you as you engage with the plays for this part of the class, that you read with a theatrical imagination. Before we get to that, let's take a quick look at some of the basic conventions of printed plays. I want to just explain this. This might be repeat or old news for a lot of you, so this is a little bit of review for some. But I know for a lot of us, we may not have actually read a play, or if we were assigned a play, we've maybe forgotten what a play is, right, or what it looks like on the page. So when you look at a play, as this is an excerpt taken from a play you're going to be reading shortly, a very short play. This is Susan Glaspell's Trifles. Uh, this is fairly typical in a printed play. At the very beginning of the play, you'll see a list of characters at the beginning, which is sometimes called the dramatis personae, especially when you're looking at, say, a Shakespeare play or a play written some centuries ago. They will call it sometimes the dramatis personae, which is Latin for the list of the characters or lists of the persons of the play. You'll notice you're often told something about those characters, either what their relationship is to other characters or what their profession might be, and so on. So you have a list of characters. You very often will have some sort of set or scene directions that tell the reader what the set and the stage are supposed to look like, and might give you background or other information for you as the reader, or for the performers who might be performing the play, to understand as context and background and setting for the play. You'll notice that you'll have speech tags or speech prefixes. They look like that. Quite often they will be in all capital letters to set them off clearly. In this case, they don't do that, but you can see here these are the speech tags. They tell you whose lines these are, because you'll notice that plays, unlike prose fiction like novels or short stories, they don't use quotation marks, because this is all dialogue. What you're reading is the lines spoken by the actors. Okay, so there's no quotation marks usually. The speech tags or speech prefixes tell you this is who's speaking. Okay, and you'll also see stage directions often printed throughout. They will often be italicized and in parentheses or brackets, and that tells you a number of things. It could tell you that there's a certain action that a character is supposed to be taking as they say this. So, for example, obviously here, rubbing his hands says to the actor playing the county attorney, hey, do this when you say this line. They may also talk about tone, how a line might be said. If the playwright wants you to say a line a certain way, that might be indicated in the stage directions. All right. Playwright, by the way, is what we call the person who writes the play, and that's playwright as one word, but W-R-I-G-H-T, like a shipwright, not W-R-I-T-E. Some other conventions to note. Note that the plays are often, not always, but they're often divided into scenes and acts and scenes, which will create a kind of organization or logic to the play. And I mean logic in quotation marks, not because it's like formal logic or something like that. What I mean is that the acts and scenes will often give us a sense of how this play works in terms of pacing, in terms of rhythm and that sort of thing. So these acts and scenes, can create a kind of pacing or rhythm for the audience and for the reader, much in the same way that in a novel, for example, we probably don't read a lot of novels that are longer, that aren't broken down into some kind of subsections, often called chapters, not always called chapters. But even in novels, might have chapters. You might have chapters grouped together into parts. You might have within chapters scenes that take place, multiple scenes that take place in chapters. So the acts and scenes are part of the organization and logic of the play. A play that has only a few scenes, but they are exceptionally long, will often feel different from a play that has more scenes, but for example, those scenes are generally shorter. And indeed, a very short scene sandwiched in between two longer scenes feels different. And we can think of an analogy to movies as well, or TV shows that we watch, right? Longer scenes versus shorter scenes, or a series of short scenes. That all creates a certain pacing or feeling for the play. And then when you're reading, please also note that different plays written in different eras or different periods have different dramatic conventions and idioms. For instance, one thing that might cause us difficulty is we probably expect when we read a play something like theatrical realism. And theatrical realism simply refers to the idea that in a play, we're supposed to be kind of faked out into thinking that we're watching real characters in a real life situation, and we're just behind an invisible fourth wall. In fact, you'll hear that term, right? The fourth wall convention. But that's actually not. That's not how all plays have worked throughout time, right? Theatrical realism is actually something that really wasn't popular and not even a thing until the 19th century. Uh, so you'll notice different plays written in different periods of time will just have sometimes strikingly different conventions and idioms or ways of sounding and speaking than we're used to. So, for example, ancient Greek drama, which we will read an example of next week, ancient Greek drama had a chorus, okay, and the chorus would sing and dance, and it would actually tell the audience directly commentary on the action happening in the play, right? And it wasn't supposed to be realistic because that wasn't an expectation of ancient Greek drama. Like Greeks didn't go to the theater thinking that they were going to watch intimate conversations taking place in somebody's dining room. It was a different kind of play. Similarly, Shakespeare's theater, if you've ever encountered Shakespeare, you were probably frustrated or turned off by the fact that Shakespeare writes in poetry quite often, and that poetry is often quite dense and doesn't sound like how people are supposed to talk. And indeed, that is correct. Even in Shakespeare's time, that is not how people actually talked, because you didn't go to a play in Shakespeare's time thinking that you were going to sit down and watch through a fourth wall an intimate conversation between people in their dining room. You went to go watch a different kind of play, and that play was spoken in poetry and had different conventions than we're used to. So just be aware of that when you read plays, that plays written in different eras have different dramatic conventions and ways of sounding that might strike us as quite odd. But I want you to be aware of that. Okay, let's talk now about that theatrical imagination thing. What do I mean by reading with a theatrical imagination? Remember, it's a play, not a novel. It lives in the theater, but because this is a literature class, and also because this is an online class, we're going to be stuck kind of reading the plays as our main engagement with them. Not our only engagement, but our main engagement. So when you read, you need to read with a mind to performance. thinking about, as you're reading, how would this text, how would this script be performed? How could it be performed on a stage today? So pay attention to scene breaks, act breaks. Pay attention to set descriptions, stage directions, and any hints in the lines and the dialogue about how characters might act out a scene, for example. Um, quite often, there are times when we can get a sense of how a scene might be performed, not because there were stage directions that gave specifics about how people were supposed to move or how they were supposed to gesture, but because of what those characters are saying. And often actors have to make decisions about how they're going to deliver lines and how they're going to gesture and what they're doing when their character is saying these lines. Um, and when you're reading, you always want to consider, when you're reading a play, you always want to consider the potential performance choices the play enables, all right? The performance choices that the play gives us or affords us. Yeah, I know. What am I saying here? What are performance choices? Um, a term that I'm using to refer to this. All the possible choices actors and directors could make to perform the play that you're reading. Okay, so let's think about that for a second. Let's say you are going to read. Let's just say you're going to read. Oh, I don't know. Um, Shakespeare's Othello. All right. Spoiler alert: you're going to read that in a couple of weeks, right? Along with other plays, but you're going to read that play as one of the plays you're going to read. And you want to get together, you're a director, you have a theater, and you have actors, and you want to put this play on. What are the things you have to consider when you're doing this play? Performance choices can refer, again in this class, performance choices can refer to any number of things, ranging from the theater and the stage space, where is it going to be performed, where is this thing going to be performed, to costumes actors are going to wear, to the sets that are going to be used or set design that will be used, if there's going to be a set at all. Okay. Um, Performance choices can include things like lighting. They can include things like, well, for example, if it's an outdoor stage, well, then lighting is a different affair, right? You may not even have lighting that's not natural lighting. That would have been the norm on Shakespeare's stage, for example, outside. Um, Performance choices include things like what actors look like and sound like. That is casting. Who is playing what parts? Uh, and where are the actors on stage at any given moment when certain lines are being said or in a given scene, right? Those are all things actors and directors will have to figure out if they're going to perform a play. So as you're reading a play, it can really be helpful to think about, well, who might play these parts? How might these lines be said? How might the actors move or gesture? What expressions might they wear on their face to communicate emotion or motive or intention? You can ask things as you're reading about tone and volume of lines when actors say certain things. Where might the emphases be? What's the pacing like of those lines? What about pauses? Are there any props or objects in play? For example, what might the character motives be? Just to give some simple examples of this. I'm just going to make this up, right? Let's say we have one line, just one line. Here's the line. I didn't say you stole the money. That's it. That's the line. I didn't say you stole the money. Let's think about how it would be if in this little one-line play, two actors have to walk on stage and one of them delivers that line to the other actor. Okay. I didn't say you stole the money. Let's say the actor saying that says it like this. I didn't say you stole the money. Or they might say it like this. I didn't say you stole the money. Or they say it like this. I didn't say you stole the money. So I think you get the idea here, right? Those are the same words, but just the changing of tone and the emotion behind it and the emphasis of that same line creates three, in some ways, totally different potential meanings. And if that's the first line of the scene, three totally different potential plots, right? Because that line tells us something has been going on, there's a conversation that's been going on, and those three different patterns that I just gave you as an example off the top of my head all suggest three different potential conversations that could have happened and therefore the beginnings of three different sorts of plots, right? Let's layer onto that. What if what if the actor saying, I didn't say you stole the money, let's say that that's Brad Pitt. So he says it. Or change it now. Let's say it's Benedict Cumberbatch. That's kind of different, right? What if it's Tom Hanks? Now you see there, just three different choices give you three different actors who look different, who sound different, who come with their own baggage and play different sorts of characters, right? Um, that subtly changes what that line means, in addition to how that line is said, right? Um, or let's say with these two actors, you have a male and a female, and the female is the one that says this line, and the female is played by, oh, I don't know, Emma Watson or something, right? Or Jennifer Lawrence, and this actress says the same line. I didn't say you stole the money. You get the idea, right? And then you can change that up. Now the actress is Helen Mirren or Judi Dench or someone like that saying the same line, and that changes it. Now I could go on and on like this, but I think you get the point. Considerations like the casting of the actors, what the actors look like and sound like, how old they are, all can change and shift the meaning of the same script in subtle but significant ways. Just as the tone and volume of line delivery, the mood behind the lines, patterns of emphasis, the pacing all contribute to how that makes meaning. Okay. So I just a small example to show you of how considering performance choices can really give us a lot of interesting potential meanings when we're reading a play. I just spoke for 3 or 4 minutes about one line. Imagine now the complexity and richness of an entire scene or an entire play when we have to think about the different performance choices that are available and the different ways that different scenes might look and sound and feel and make meaning depending upon these various performance possibilities or performance choices. Some other tips for reading plays in addition to these. If you have access, if you can find the performance of a play online somewhere, or if you find a recording of just a reading of it or a recitation of the play, go ahead and like watch it or listen to it as you read along. Absolutely do that. It's a performance text, right? It is a script. We will get a lot more out of it if we listen to it or are able to watch it. If you can't do that, or even if you can do that, you should read aloud as much as possible. If in any genre, boy, in drama, this is helpful, right? What does it feel like to say that line if you're that actor? So read aloud as much as possible when you're reading. And in a riff on something I taught you earlier in the semester, imagine two or three contrasting performance possibilities when you want to examine something carefully and deepen your understanding of it. As I just dramatized in my little I didn't say you stole the money line, um, it can be really interesting to take a moment or a speech or a brief bit of dialogue or a scene and just imagine it played out two or three very different ways. And that can be a really helpful way of digging into the text and understanding the various possibilities for meaning that the lines are giving us. Finally, remember, it's alive. In other literary forms, the text is the text. That is the words on the page, right? So the novel is my whipping boy for this, right? When you're reading a novel, the text of the novel is the text of the novel, and you're going to read it, and you are participating in the story as the words go into your head, right? But plays are performance texts, and they exist in their performance. Again, stage and page, two worlds. Note also that every performance of a play is different, even in the same run, meaning like, a theater company puts on Shakespeare's Othello or puts on Glassbill's Trifles, and they do it for 3 weeks in a row, and they have 9 different performances in those 3 weeks. Every one of those 9 performances will be different, right? Using the exact same script, those performances will be different. There are a lot of reasons for that. One of those reasons could be that it's clear that in in a particular performance, a scene fell flat, and the actors could feel it in the audience, and they needed to revise how they did that scene. It could be that the director wanted to try and experiment something and do something a little bit differently with the play, and they, will maybe revise slightly something with the set, right? Or they will change a prop because they want to try something new, or because the old prop broke and now they have to use something different, right? Um, things can also change the performance because actors and directors and even the playwrights themselves or the screenwriters, they like to experiment and have fun with it to see what different effects they can have with changes. We should also note that to keep a play alive throughout time, the play must breathe and speak to its audience. And so that does mean that uh, will probably note that lots of plays have been performed many, many times and will be performed many, many times for several lifetimes to come. I mean, Shakespeare comes to mind, but tons of plays out there in cities that have theaters are in repertory, meaning that they are performed frequently by the different theater companies. Okay, so to keep a play alive, plays will often be adapted, cut, rearranged in a number of different ways to bring a fresh perspective to the play, right? So we should be aware of that, and this will make sense when we think about movies, right? Especially movies for which there are multiple versions, um, which we can look at, right? You will see that different productions of a movie, different productions of a play will often adapt the text or cut lines or rearrange them to make kind of a slightly different version of it, right? And that's an interesting question in and of itself of when does a play become a different version of itself? Um, a good example of this is thinking about some of Shakespeare's plays. Again, I come back to Shakespeare because that's just one of my areas of expertise and interest. But we know, for example, that Shakespeare's plays were probably not performed in the long form that we have them every time they were performed. If you've ever read Hamlet, or at least heard of Hamlet, if you perform that play as we have it today, it will take a full 4.5 hours. And it's pretty clear that even in Shakespeare's day, nobody went to a play that was 4.5 hours long. No one did that. Okay, we know that from the historical record, which means that the play was probably cut and rearranged and adapted at various times throughout its life for different audiences and different occasions and for different running times. Um, so, as a result of this dynamic life in drama and the way that plays live in their performance and that performances can be different from one to the next, and the way that plays are often adapted, cut, and rearranged by actors and directors, and sometimes even by the playwrights themselves in order to create something fresh and new and different. Watching multiple performances of a play can teach us a lot about the potential meanings of a play. Um, so that's an important thing as well. Watching multiple performances or versions of, say, Othello or another play can teach us a lot about that text and a lot about the potential meanings that are there. And then finally, as a takeaway, like life, drama through performance is about possibilities. Okay. So I want you to take that from this lecture, this notion that, yeah, we have a play on the page, and that is an important way to transmit it. And in fact, to perform the play, we have to have a script, we have to have the written play. But we always want to remember that it's through performance that all the possibilities of that play get to be realized in real life before a living, breathing audience.